Mira had not sat down in 21 days. She stood behind the counter of the messenger station in Stonefang Hold, the border fortress where she had worked since she was 16, sorting dispatch scrolls and logging arrival times with hands that trembled when she thought no one was watching. She stood because sitting was not possible. Sitting required lowering her weight onto the parts of her body that had been dragged across 40 feet of fortress stone 3 weeks ago. And those parts, her lower back, her thighs, the base of her spine, were a geography of damage that the clan's healer had looked at and looked away from and declared to be the result of a training accident. It had not been a training accident. The fortress knew this, the healer knew this, and Kelgan, son of Chieftain Theron, the man who had done it, certainly knew this. Every shift of Mira's weight sent jagged spikes of pain shooting up her spine and radiating through her lower body. The wounds beneath her clothing were infected. She could feel the heat of them, the particular, spreading warmth that meant the body was losing a battle against something that had been left to fester. The fortress healer, Orvek, had given her a jar of common salve and told her she was overreacting. He had not cleaned the stone fragments from the cuts. He had not examined the depth of the lacerations. He had stood in his treatment room with Chieftain Theron's shadow behind him and told Mira that she had taken a clumsy fall during chain drill and that she needed to walk it off. Walk it off, as though the skin across her lower back was not a canvas of shredded tissue, as though the reason she could not sit was theatrical rather than structural, as though the stone fragments embedded in her flesh were a matter of perspective rather than a matter of sepsis. Mira, dear, you look terrible. The voice belonged to an orc woman named Sulka, the wife of one of the fortress captains. She was collecting a dispatch scroll, her expression carrying the particular rehearsed concern of someone performing kindness, without intending to deliver it. Mira swallowed. The pain flared. It did this when she spoke, when she shifted, when she breathed too deeply. The act of existing had become an act of management. It hurts when I sit, Sulka, Mira said. Her voice trembled. The wounds aren't closing. I think the infection is deep. I think something is. Now, Mira. Sulka's expression hardened. The rehearsed concern vanished, replaced by the particular, cold mask that people wore when they had decided to look away and needed to justify the looking. Orvek said it was a training accident. Chain drill. It happens to everyone. You need to be stronger about this. You're an orc woman, not a human child. Sit through the pain, and it will pass. She took her scroll and left. The door closed behind her with a sound that was too small for the silence it left. Mira closed her eyes. A single tear cut through the dust on her cheek. It had happened 3 weeks ago, on the training ground behind the fortress walls. Kelgan had cornered her at dusk, when the training yard was empty and the evening watch had not yet started. He was the chieftain's son, tall, broad, carrying the particular structural arrogance of a person who had never been told no by anyone whose opinion he was required to respect. He had been pursuing Mira for months. Not courting, pursuing, with the particular predatory persistence of a man who viewed rejection as a temporary inconvenience rather than a boundary. Mira had rejected him, clearly. She had rejected him the orc way, directly, without softening, with the precise and final language that orc women used when they meant no, and intended the no to be permanent. Kelgan had decided to teach her what happened to women who said no to the chieftain's son. He had used a training chain, not a weapon, a training chain the kind used in fortress drills, heavy iron links designed to build strength and endurance. He had looped it around her ankles, attached the other end to his war mount's harness, and driven the animal forward. Mira had been dragged 40 feet across the fortress training ground. The surface was not dirt, it was stone. Fortress stone laid flat for drilling, with the particular abrasive texture of rock that had been cut but not polished. Her clothing had provided little protection. The stone had opened her skin from her lower back to her thighs, in parallel furrows that were deep enough to see tissue beneath. When Kelgan had finally stopped the mount, he had looked down at her, bleeding, broken, gasping on the stone, and he had said, "Next time I ask, think carefully." He had ridden away. Mira had crawled to the healer's station. She had crawled because standing was not possible and because the fortress was empty, and because the 40 feet between the training ground and the healer's door was the longest distance she had ever crossed. When Orvek examined her, Chieftain Theron had been standing in the doorway, not speaking, not threatening. simply present. The silent, enormous presence of the most powerful man in the fortress, whose son had just dragged a messenger girl across 40 feet of stone because she had told him no. Orvek had looked at Mira's wounds. He had looked at Theron. He had looked at the wounds again. Training accident, Orvek had said. Chain drill. Clumsy footwork. I'll give you salve. He had not cleaned the stone fragments from the cuts. He had not treated the depth of the lacerations. He had handed her a jar of common salve, the kind used for minor scrapes, useless against the kind of damage she had sustained, and he had sent her away. The diagnosis was officially recorded as a training accident. Mira's attempts to speak were met with the particular organized silence of a community that had agreed, without discussion, to look away. Clan honor required it. The chieftain's son could not be accused by a messenger girl. The hierarchy was clear, and the hierarchy was more important than the truth, and the truth was bleeding through Mira's clothing every time she moved. She could not sleep, she could not rest, and most agonizingly, she could not sit. The wounds across her lower back and thighs were positioned exactly where the body's weight settled when seated, and every attempt to lower herself onto any surface produced a pain so immediate and so total that her vision went white. So she stood, 21 days, in the messenger station, sorting scrolls and logging arrivals, and doing the work she had always done, because the work was the only thing she could still do, and because stopping would mean sitting, and sitting was the one thing her body would not allow. The door of the messenger station opened on the morning of the 22nd day. The man who entered was not Orc. He was human, average height, lean, with the particular compact build of a person who had learned to move through spaces occupied by people larger than himself, without taking up more room than necessary. He wore the uniform of the Border Patrol, the neutral gray coat with the treaty insignia on the shoulder, the mark of the human inspectors who traveled the Orc-human border twice a year to verify that the terms of the peace agreement were being maintained. His name was Phelan. He had been doing border inspections for 6 years, and in that time he had learned 2 things that most humans never learned: how to speak Orcish and how to read Orc bodies the way Orc trackers read terrain. The second skill he had learned not from Orcs, but from a battlefield medic, a woman named Sergeant Voss, who had served in the border wars and who had taught Phelan that the body was a document. Every wound tells a story, Voss had said, and the story the body tells is always more honest than the story the mouth tells. Learn to read bodies, Phelan. The bodies never lie. Phelan moved quietly. He approached the counter, set down a bundle of border inspection documents, and looked at the Orc woman behind the counter. He saw her immediately, not the way the fortress saw her, as a messenger girl, as a fixture, as a person whose presence was functional and whose suffering was inconvenient. He saw her the way Sergeant Voss had taught him to see, as a body telling a story. The story was this: her spine was rigid, not the rigidity of good posture, the rigidity of a body that was protecting something, the particular locked straight alignment that occurred when the muscles along the spine contracted to prevent movement, because movement meant contact, and contact meant pain. Her weight was distributed wrong. She was standing with her weight forward, on the balls of her feet, the way a person stood when they were trying to keep their weight off their heels and their lower body. Not the stance of fatigue, the stance of avoidance. The fever, he could see it in the color of the sweat on her neck. Orc skin flushed differently than human skin when infected. Human skin went red. Orc skin went dark, the green deepening to near black in the areas where the immune response was concentrated. The darkening along the back of Mira's neck said infection, the kind that had been burning for weeks. And then he saw the marks. She was wearing boots, heavy Orc messenger boots, laced high. But above the boot line, just visible at the edge of her trouser cuff, were marks. Thick, purplish black rings around both ankles. Not bruises. Abrasions. The specific patterned abrasion that heavy chain links produced when they were wrapped tight around flesh and then subjected to tension. Phelan knew the difference between training chain marks and dragging chain marks. Training chains were used in controlled drills. The marks they left were uniform, circular, evenly distributed. The marks on Mira's ankles were irregular, deeper on one side, torn on the other, the asymmetric pattern that occurred when a chain was pulled rather than held, when a body was moving against its will across a surface that was not smooth. I need these inspection documents logged, Phelan said. His voice was quiet, not timid, but calibrated. The voice of a man who understood that volume was a tool and that the current situation required precision rather than force. Mira reached for the documents as she shifted her stance to take them. A spasm seized her back, the particular vicious contraction of muscles that were guarding damaged tissue and had been guarding it for 3 weeks without rest. She gasped. Her knees buckled for a fraction of a second. She caught herself on the counter's edge, biting her lip hard enough to draw blood. Phelan did not look away. He did not produce the polite, averted gaze that the fortress residents had perfected over 3 weeks of practice. He stood perfectly still, and he watched. And what he watched was not the gasping or the pain or the blood on her lip. He watched the way she recovered, the automatic, practiced recovery of a person who had been managing this level of pain for long enough that the management had become routine. "You're standing on borrowed time," Phelan said softly. The gentleness of his tone contrasted sharply with the clinical precision of what he had just observed. Mira flinched. "I'm fine, sir. Training accident. Chain drill. Orvek says I need to walk it off." "Training chains leave round marks," Phelan said. "Even pressure symmetrical pattern. What's on your ankles isn't round. It's torn. One side deeper than the other. That's a dragging pattern, not a training pattern." He leaned his forearms on the counter, brought his face closer to hers. "And chain drill doesn't produce a 3-week fever? And a training accident doesn't make a woman stand for 21 days because her body is too damaged to bear her own weight when she sits." Mira's breath hitched. Panic flooded her chest. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't. You don't understand how things work here." "I understand a lie when I hear one," Phelan said evenly. "And I understand sepsis. You've got an infection burning through you. Another few days, and they'll be digging your grave. Who did this?" Mira looked at this man, this small, quiet human who had walked into her station and read her body in 30 seconds with a precision that the fortress healer had spent 3 weeks pretending was impossible. A man who was looking at her with an expression she had not seen in 21 days. The expression of a person who believed her. "It hurts when I sit," she said. The words broke open. Not loud, not dramatic, but with the particular devastating clarity of a truth that has been spoken 100 times to people who refused to hear it and is now, finally, being spoken to someone who is listening. "It hurts so much, and everyone just looks right through me." If those words just hit you in the chest, if you know what it feels like to say something true and be told you're overreacting, hit subscribe. It's free. It costs nothing, and it tells us this story matters enough to keep telling. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from tonight? Because Mira's story is being heard right now in places we never imagined. And we want to know you're there. Phelan's jaw tightened. He had spent 6 years on the border, moving between human and orc settlements, documenting treaty compliance, and resolving disputes that the peace agreement was supposed to prevent. He had seen cruelty in both worlds, human cruelty, orc cruelty, the particular species' blind capacity for damage that sentient creatures inflicted on each other regardless of the color of their skin or the shape of their teeth. But the cruelty of systems was always worse than the cruelty of individuals, because an individual could be confronted. A system looked away. "Close the station," Phelan said. "I can't. Chieftain Theron, I am a treaty inspector. My authority supersedes the chieftains in matters of border compliance. I am telling you to close this station." Mira looked at him. The panic was still there. The particular wide-eyed fear of a person who had been living inside a system that punished visibility and who was being asked to become visible. But underneath, the panic was something else, something she had not felt in 21 days. A small, terrifying spark. She hobbled to the front door. She closed it. She drew the heavy bar across the frame. The station was dim, quiet. The scroll shelves lined the walls. The counter stood between them. Phelan moved around the counter, slowly, without sudden motion, the way a person moved around a wounded animal that had been given reason to distrust approach. He guided her to the back room where the messenger supplies were stored. Rolls of leather, ink pots, a narrow cot that Mira had not been able to use for 3 weeks because lying down required the same contact that sitting required. "Lean over the supply sacks," Phelan said. "Support your upper body. Take the weight off your legs without putting pressure on your back." She did. The relief was not complete. Nothing short of actual treatment would be complete, but the partial reduction in load was enough to make her exhale for the first time in hours. Phelan pulled a stool beside her. He sat. Then he spoke to her in Orcish, not the simple phrases that human border officials learned for basic communication, the trade words, the greetings, the functional vocabulary of diplomacy. Full Orcish, the chest-resonant, vibrating language that carried meaning through sound as much as through vocabulary. "Tell me what happened," he said, in her language, in the language that her mother had spoken, and her grandmother had spoken, and that lived in the part of her body that was older than thought. Mira's reaction was immediate and involuntary. Her shoulders dropped. The rigid, locked posture that she had been maintaining for 3 weeks, the posture of a person holding themselves together by force of will, softened by 3 degrees, small, almost invisible. But Phelan saw it, because Sergeant Voss had taught him to see the degrees, and the degrees were where the truth lived. In Orc culture, language was not merely communication. Language was architecture. Orcish was built from the chest. The words vibrated through the sternum and the ribs before they reached the mouth, and the vibration carried emotional information that the speaker could not suppress. Joy vibrated differently from grief. Truth vibrated differently from falsehood. Lying in Orcish was physically difficult. Not impossible. Orcs could lie. But the body resisted. The chest tightened. A fluent listener could hear the difference between an Orc speaking truth and an Orc constructing a lie the way a musician could hear the difference between a note played in tune and a note played slightly flat. Phelan was a fluent listener. 6 years on the border had made him one. "Tell me," he said again, in Orcish. And Mira told him. The words came out in Orcish, not the careful, edited Orcish that she used for official dispatches, but the raw, unstructured Orcish of a person speaking from the place where language began. The chest, the ribs, the part of the body that the words vibrated through before they reached the mouth. She told him about the training ground, about Kelgan, about the months of pursuit that she had refused, and the final refusal that had broken something in him. Not heartbreak, not rejection, but the particular, explosive fury of a man whose authority had been challenged by a person he considered beneath him. She told him about the chain, the training chain, heavy iron links, the kind used in fortress drills, how Kelgan had wrapped it around her ankles and attached the other end to his mount's harness, how the animal had moved forward, and the chain had gone tight, and the first thing she felt was not pain but surprise, because the body did not immediately understand what was happening to it. The understanding came second after the first 3 feet of stone. She told him about the 40 feet, the surface fortress stone, flat-laid, abrasive, how her clothing had torn in the first 10 feet, and how the stone had reached her skin after that, how the parallel furrows had opened across her back and thighs with a particular, methodical precision of damage inflicted by a surface that did not discriminate between flesh and fabric. She told him about crawling to the healer, about Orvek's examination, about Chieftain Theron standing in the doorway without speaking, the silent mass of authority that did not need to threaten because its presence was the threat. She told him about the salve, the common salve, the one for scrapes, handed to a woman whose lower body was a landscape of infected lacerations, about the stone fragments that Orvek had looked at and left in her flesh, about the official record, training accident, chain drill, clumsy footwork. She told him about 21 days of standing, about the fever that had started on day 8 and had been burning since, about the darkness in the skin along her neck that she could see in mirrors, and that she knew, even without medical training, meant the infection was winning. And she told him about the words, the 2 words she had said to every person who entered the messenger station for 3 weeks, the simple, agonizing truth she had begged the fortress to hear. "It hurts when I sit." When she finished, the room was quiet. The supply sacks beneath her arms were damp with sweat. Her breathing was ragged, the exhalation of a person who had been carrying something for 3 weeks and had just set it down. Phelan was still, the particular, absolute stillness of a person who was processing information and whose body had gone quiet to allow the processing to complete. Then he spoke, not in Orcish, in common tongue. The shift was deliberate. Orcish was for the telling, common tongue was for the doing. "I'm going to treat you," he said. "I need supplies. I'll be back in 10 minutes. Don't open the door for anyone." He did not go to the fortress healer. He did not go to any orc facility. He went to the Border Patrol supply cache, the locked chest that treaty inspectors carried, stocked with the field medical kit that Sergeant Voss had designed, and that every border medic was trained to use. He returned with clean linen, a flask of distilled grain alcohol, a set of fine steel tweezers, a suturing needle, treated thread, and 3 pouches of dried antiseptic moss, the Border Patrol's standard wound treatment, proven effective on both human and orc physiology. "This is going to hurt," he said, his voice gentle with the precision that gentleness sometimes had. Not soft, but exact. "But it will save your life. I need to see the wounds." Mira's face burned. The particular layered shame of a woman who was about to expose damage that had been inflicted in the most degrading way possible to a man she had known for less than an hour. But the pain overrode the shame. The 21 days overrode the shame. The fever overrode the shame. She loosened her clothing and allowed the wounds to be visible. Even Phelan, a man who had been trained by a battlefield medic, who had seen sword wounds and arrow damage and the particular, systematic destruction that war inflicted on bodies, drew in a breath. The skin across her lower back, her upper thighs, and the base of her spine was a record of brutality. Deep parallel gouges from the fortress stone ran in lines that followed the direction of the dragging. Consistent, methodical, the marks of a body that had been pulled across an abrasive surface for a sustained distance. The tissue around the gouges was necrotic, dead, discolored, weeping the particular fluid that meant the body had given up on healing those areas and was now trying to wall them off from the rest of itself. The surrounding skin was dark with infection, the deepening green-black of orc immune response, spreading outward from the wound sites in patterns that Phelan recognized from Sergeant Voss's training. Sepsis progression. The infection was no longer localized. It was moving. "They left you to rot," Phelan said. His voice was even, but the evenness was the kind that required effort. "They looked at this and left you to die to protect a chieftain's son. Can you fix it?" She whispered into the supply sacks. "I can." He worked for 2 hours. He used the grain alcohol to sterilize the wound surfaces, apologizing in Orcish each time Mira bit down on a leather strap to suppress the sounds that the cleaning produced. He used the tweezers, sterilized over a candle flame, to extract the stone fragments that Orvek had deliberately left embedded, small, jagged pieces of fortress stone, each one a piece of evidence that the healer had chosen to leave inside a living body, rather than remove it and acknowledge what had caused it. 12 fragments from the largest laceration, 8 from the second, 6 from a deep gouge near her right hip, and then, from the deepest wound, the one at the base of her spine, the one that had been causing the most pain, the one that had been the source of the spreading infection. His tweezers caught on something that was not stone. He pulled it out, wiped away the blood, held it under the candlelight. A chain link, small, an inch long, the kind that broke off from heavy iron training chains under extreme tension, the kind that would snap when the chain was pulled hard enough across a surface that caught and held it. On the surface of the length, stamped into the iron, a mark, a clan seal. Kelgan's personal seal, the mark that orc warriors stamped onto their personal training equipment to identify it. Phelan held the link between his tweezers. He looked at it. The candlelight caught the clan seal sharp and clear against the dark iron. "Mira," he said softly, "does Kelgan carry a personal training chain with his seal on the links?" Mira turned her head. Her feverish eyes focused on the small piece of iron. She nodded. "Custom forged," she said weakly. "He had it made at the Eastern Foundry. He shows it to everyone." Phelan folded the chain link into a clean piece of linen and placed it in the breast pocket of his border patrol coat. It was not just a piece of iron. It was irrefutable physical proof, stamped with a personal seal, extracted from a wound that the fortress healer had declared was caused by a training accident. Proof that Orvek had covered up. Proof that a chieftain's son had used his own equipment to brutalize a woman, and that the evidence had been sitting inside her body for 3 weeks, while the system that was supposed to protect her pretended it didn't exist. He applied the antiseptic moss in thick layers, the poultice drawing heat from the infected tissue, the natural compounds beginning the slow, steady process of killing the bacteria that had been growing unchecked for 21 days. He sealed the worst wounds with treated linen, binding them tight enough to hold but loose enough to allow the tissue to breathe. "You can lie down now," Phelan said. "On your side, not your back." He helped her shift onto the narrow cot, slowly, carefully, supporting her weight so that the transition from vertical to horizontal happened in increments rather than in a single agonizing drop. Mira lay on her side. For the first time in 21 days, the weight was off her legs. The pressure was off her wounds. The constant, burning 3-week agony that had been her entire existence subsided. Not to nothing, not to comfort, but to a level that her body recognized as survivable rather than annihilating. She cried, not quietly, not with the controlled, disciplined tears of an orc woman who had been taught that crying was weakness. She cried the way a person cries when they have been standing for 21 days and someone has finally told them they can lie down. The sound filled the small room and leaked through the door into the station beyond. The sound of a person who had been holding herself together by force of will and who was, for the first time in 3 weeks, being held by someone else. Phelan sat beside the cot. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He was present, the quiet, steady presence of a man who understood that the most important thing he could offer at this moment was not words or comfort, but witness. The act of sitting beside a person who was crying and not looking away. "Thank you," she said, when the crying had subsided enough to allow words. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Phelan looked at her. His expression was calm, but beneath the calm was something harder. The particular, controlled anger of a person who had seen a system fail and who had decided in the specific way that people of conscience decided such things, that the failure was his problem now. "Because in every settlement I inspect," he said, "human and orc, there is always someone standing when they should be sitting, and there is always someone who looked at their wounds and looked away, and the looking away is always worse than the wound." He paused. "You told the truth for 21 days, and nobody believed you. I believe you, and I have the proof in my pocket. Right now, Mira is lying down for the first time in 3 weeks. And a man she met an hour ago is the only person who believed what an entire fortress refused to hear. If this story is making your chest tight, if you know what it's like to tell the truth and be told you're exaggerating, subscribe. It's free. It costs you nothing except one click, and it means Mira's story keeps reaching people who need to hear it. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because right now this story is being heard across borders that Mira never imagined she'd cross. And we want to know you're listening. Before Mira could respond, a heavy fist hammered against the station door. The sound was enormous, the particular violent percussion of an orc fist against heavy oak. Not a knock, a demand. "Mira Prescott," a harsh voice from the corridor. "We know the human inspector is in there. Chieftain Theron wants him. Open this door." Mira's heart slammed against her ribs. She looked at Phelan with the wide, feverish eyes of a person who understood exactly what was about to happen. The quiet, systematic erasure of the last hour, the return to the 21 days, the closing of the small window that had just opened. "They'll kill you," she whispered. "Kelgan's warriors. They're not guards, they're his personal." "How many?" Phelan asked. His voice had not changed, the same quiet, calibrated tone. 3. Maybe 4. "Are they wearing fortress insignia or personal insignia?" Mira blinked. The question was unexpected, tactical rather than emotional, the question of a man who was already thinking 3 moves ahead. "Personal," she said. "Kelgan's seal." Phelan nodded. He stood. He straightened his border patrol coat, the gray coat with the treaty insignia on the shoulder. He adjusted the insignia so it was clearly visible. Then he walked to the door and unbarred it. He did not slam the door open. He opened it with the slow, deliberate control of a man who understood that the opening was a statement. 3 orc warriors stood in the corridor, Kelgan's personal guard, large armored, carrying the particular, entitled aggression of men who enforced a chieftain's son's will and who had learned that enforcement was easier than thought. The lead warrior looked down at Phelan. The size difference was considerable. The orc was a foot taller and twice his weight. The warrior's hand rested on his weapon belt. "Step aside, human." You're trespassing on fortress property. Phelan did not step aside. He did not raise his voice. He touched the treaty insignia on his shoulder, a small gesture casual, the way a person touches a button to confirm it's fastened. My name is Inspector Phelan, attached to the Border Treaty Commission. I am conducting an official inspection of this facility under Article 7 of the Peace Agreement. This station is currently under treaty jurisdiction. I don't care about your treaty. You should. Phelan's voice dropped, not to a whisper, to the particular low register that carried more weight than shouting because it required the listener to pay attention. Article 7, Section 3. Any obstruction of a treaty inspector during an active inspection constitutes a violation of the peace agreement. Violations are reported directly to Border Command. Border Command responds with a full military detachment. He paused. Let the pause do the work. You are currently obstructing. I am currently inspecting. The question is whether Chieftain Theron wants a full human military detachment at his gates within the week, because if that hand moves 1 inch closer to that weapon, that is exactly what he will get. The lead warrior's hand stopped. The hand hovered, not retreating, not advancing. The hand of a man who was processing information that changed his calculation. The chieftain will hear about this, the warrior said. I'm counting on it, Phelan said. Tell him I'll be conducting my inspection for the rest of the day, and tell him that the inspection includes a review of the fortress medical facility. The warriors looked at each other, the particular silent communication of men who had been given orders and were now discovering that the orders conflicted with a larger authority. They left. Not quickly. Orc warriors did not retreat quickly, because retreat implied defeat, and defeat implied shame. They withdrew with deliberate slowness, the pace of men who wanted to communicate that the withdrawal was a choice rather than a concession. Phelan closed the door. He barred it. He turned to Mira. She was watching him from the cot, her expression equal parts fear and astonishment. You just threatened Chieftain Theron with the human army, she said. I cited treaty law. The army is a consequence of the law, not a threat. He paused. There's a difference, and the difference matters, because what I'm about to do next needs to be legal. Phelan crossed the fortress corridor, alone. He walked the way he always walked in orc fortresses, quietly, without taking up space, the particular calibrated movement of a small man in a large world who had learned that presence was about authority, not size. He found the healer's facility at the end of the corridor. The door was open. Orvek was inside, a thick-set orc with the particular soft hands of a person who worked with medicines rather than weapons. He was arranging jars on a shelf with the exaggerated focus of someone who had heard the commotion and was pretending to be busy. Phelan entered without knocking. He closed the door behind him. Orvek turned. His expression performed surprise, the wide eyes, the slightly open mouth, the rehearsed innocence of a person who was guilty and who had been practicing not guilty for 3 weeks. Inspector, Orvek said. What can I— Sit down, Phelan said. Orvek did not sit. He stood at his shelf, his hands among his jars, his eyes calculating distance and escape. I have examined the messenger girl, Phelan said. I have treated her wounds, and I have a question for you that I need you to answer with precision, because your answer will determine whether this conversation ends in your treatment room or in a treaty tribunal. Orvek's hand stopped moving among the jars. The lacerations on the girl's lower body contain embedded stone fragments, Phelan said. Fortress stone. 26 fragments across 9 separate wounds. The fragments were not superficial. They were seated deep in the tissue, in positions consistent with high-velocity contact against an abrasive surface. He paused. Let the clinical language settle. A competent healer examining those wounds on the first day would have removed those fragments as a matter of basic treatment. Leaving stone in open wounds guarantees infection. Any healer trained in wound care knows this. You are trained in wound care. Orvek's face was changing color, the orc equivalent of going pale, the green draining to a sickly yellow. The infection in her body is systemic, Phelan continued. Sepsis, the kind that develops when contaminated material is left in wounds for an extended period. Not days, weeks. The infection pattern is consistent with deliberate neglect rather than incompetence. He stepped closer, and from the deepest wound, The one at the base of her spine, the one that has been producing the most pain, the one that has been the primary source of the spreading infection. I extracted this." He reached into his breast pocket and produced the linen-wrapped chain link. He unfolded the linen. He held the link up so that Orvek could see the clan seal stamped into the iron. "This is a link from Kelgan's personal training chain," Phelan said. "It was embedded in her flesh. The seal is legible. You examined these wounds on the first day. You either found this link and removed it and destroyed it, or you found this link and left it inside her body, deliberately knowing that the iron would accelerate the infection and that the infection would eventually kill her." He set the chain link on the desk between them. "Which was it, Orvek?" The room was very quiet. The jars on the shelf. The desk between them. The chain link with its clan seal, dark with blood, sitting on the wood like an accusation. Orvek's composure broke. It did not break dramatically. It crumbled, the way structures crumble when the foundation is removed. The rehearsed innocence, the careful neutrality, the 3 weeks of performed ignorance, all of it fell away, and what was left was a man who had done something he could not undo, and who was now being asked to account for it by someone who could not be bribed, threatened, or intimidated into looking away. "Theron," Orvek said. His voice was small, the voice of a man whose size was suddenly irrelevant. Chieftain Theron was in the room. His son had done this. If I reported the true injuries, if I documented chain marks dragging wounds, the link, Theron would have destroyed me. My practice, my family. "So you left stone in her body," Phelan said. "And you left iron in her body, and you gave her common salve for wounds that required surgery, and you told her to walk it off. I had no choice. You had a choice. You chose the chieftain over the patient. That is a choice, and you will own it." Phelan placed a piece of treated leather on the desk, the Orc formal document material. He set an inkpot beside it. "A quill. You are going to write a sworn medical statement detailing the exact nature of Mira's injuries. You will describe the lacerations, the chain marks, the stone fragments, the chain link, and the localized sepsis you deliberately allowed to develop. You will state that the injuries are entirely consistent with being dragged by chain across Fortress Stone, not with a training accident, and you will sign it with your healer's mark." Orvek looked at the leather. He looked at the chain link. He looked at Phelan, the small, quiet human who was standing in his treatment room with the particular, immovable certainty of a man who had decided what was going to happen and was not interested in alternatives. He wrote. His hand shook. The Orc script wobbled on the leather, the handwriting of a man whose body was confessing what his mouth had spent 3 weeks denying. When he finished, Phelan took the leather, blew on the ink, and folded it into his coat alongside the chain link. "If you leave this fortress before the tribunal arrives," Phelan said, "that will be interpreted as an admission of guilt and a flight from treaty jurisdiction. Stay here. Answer questions honestly when they come. That is the only path that does not end in a border prison." He left the healer's room. Orvek sat at his desk, alone, his hands flat on the wood, staring at the empty space where the leather had been. Phelan returned to the messenger station. Mira was sitting up on the cot, not sitting fully but propped on her side, the partial position that allowed consciousness without the full weight contact that her wounds could not yet tolerate. "We have to leave," Phelan said. "I have the healer's confession and the chain link. But Theron is going to move against us when he understands what I have. He'll try to destroy the evidence. Where will we go? The border outpost. Neutral territory, neither Orc jurisdiction nor human jurisdiction. Treaty ground. Kelgan can't touch us there, and his father's authority ends at the border." He went to the messenger station's pigeon roost, the small alcove where the border patrol kept its communication birds. He wrote a dispatch in the compressed code that treaty inspectors used. Location, nature of incident, evidence secured, requesting tribunal deployment. He attached it to the patrol pigeon and released it through the window. The bird climbed into the morning sky and banked south toward the border command post. The message would arrive by nightfall. The response, a treaty tribunal, accompanied by border guards, would arrive within 3 days. Phelan helped Mira stand. She was weak. The fever, the blood loss, the 21 days of standing without rest had depleted her in ways that 2 hours of treatment could address, but not reverse. She leaned on him, an Orc woman leaning on a human man half her weight, the physical absurdity of the arrangement irrelevant because the arrangement worked. He was steady. She was vertical. They moved. He had a border patrol wagon hitched behind the fortress, the standard issue supply wagon that inspectors used to travel between posts. He helped Mira into the wagon bed, laying her on the canvas supplies, arranging the packs to support her position so that she could travel without lying on her wounds. They left Stonefang Hold as the sun reached its midpoint. Phelan drove the wagon south, toward the border, toward the outpost that sat on the line between orc territory and human territory like a period at the end of a sentence. Small, definitive, marking the place where one world ended and another began. The border outpost was a modest structure, stone walls, a watchtower, a small infirmary, quarters for the rotating garrison of human and orc border guards who maintained the neutral zone. It was not comfortable. It was not grand. It was the architectural equivalent of a handshake, functional, honest, built for the specific purpose of two sides coexisting in a shared space. Mira had never been here. She had never been outside orc territory. Her entire life had been lived within the boundaries of the clan. Born in Stonefang Hold, raised in Stonefang Hold, trained as a messenger in Stonefang Hold, the world beyond the border was a concept, not an experience. The outpost received them without ceremony. The garrison commander, a human woman named Sergeant Vara, read Phelan's credentials, assessed the situation, and assigned Mira to the infirmary without questions beyond the medical ones. The infirmary was small, 4 beds, clean, occupied by 2 other patients, a human border guard with a broken arm from a patrol accident, and an orc trader who had developed a lung infection on the road. Mira lay in her bed, on her side, on clean sheets, in a room where the other patients paid her no particular attention because they were occupied with their own healing, and because, in this place, an orc woman lying in a bed beside a human man was not remarkable. It was simply what the outpost contained. Nobody called her too orc. Nobody called her too human. Nobody told her to be stronger, or to walk it off, or to stop being dramatic. The infirmary existed for the purpose of healing, and healing was what it did, without commentary, without judgment, without the particular layered social architecture that Stonefang Hold had built around her suffering. Phelan changed her dressings daily. The antiseptic moss was working, the infection was retreating, the necrotic tissue being replaced by the slow, painful, healthy pink of new growth. The fever broke on the 3rd day. The color returned to her skin, the deep green replacing the sickly yellow, the body reclaiming itself from the infection that had been winning. On the 4th day, Mira sat up, not propped on her side, sitting, upright, her weight on the bed, her back against the wall, her legs extended in front of her. It hurt. Not the blinding white vision agony of 3 weeks ago. A deep, dull, manageable ache. The ache of healing rather than the ache of damage. The difference between a wound that was closing and a wound that was opening. She sat, and the sitting did not destroy her, and she pressed her hands flat on the mattress and felt the weight of her body being supported by something beneath her, and she breathed. "It doesn't hurt," she said. Phelan was sitting in the chair beside her bed, writing his inspection report. He looked up. "When I sit," she said, "it doesn't hurt." Her voice cracked on the last word, not from pain, but from the particular, overwhelming experience of speaking a sentence she had not been able to speak for 3 weeks. The opposite of the sentence she had been saying. The mirror image, the answer. "It doesn't hurt when I sit." Phelan set down his pen. "No," he said, "it doesn't." And Mira sat in the border outpost infirmary, surrounded by clean sheets and quiet air and the sounds of 2 other patients breathing. And she cried, not from grief, from relief, from the particular bone-deep release of a body that had been standing for 21 days and had finally been allowed to rest. Kelgan came on the 6th day. He did not come with a posse. He did not come on his father's orders. He came alone, because the thing that had driven him to drag a woman across 40 feet of stone was the same thing that drove him to ride alone to the border, the particular, structural inability to accept that a person he considered beneath him had escaped the consequences he had designed for her. Pride. Not the kind that sustained a person through hardship, the kind that consumed them, the kind that said, "I will follow this to the end, not because the end is worth reaching, but because stopping would mean admitting I was wrong, and admitting I was wrong is more unbearable than any outcome." He rode through the border territory at night. His war mount was fast bred for the mountains, and he carried his personal training chain coiled at his saddle, the same chain missing its broken link that had been wrapped around Mira's ankles 3 weeks ago. He arrived at the outpost at dawn. The watchtower guard saw him first. A single orc rider approaching from the north, riding hard, carrying iron. The guard sounded the alert, 3 sharp notes on the signal horn that meant incoming hostile, single combatant. The outpost garrison responded with the practiced efficiency of a unit that had been trained for exactly this scenario. 4 guards, 2 human, 2 orc, took positions at the outpost gate. Sergeant Vara took command from the watchtower. Phelan moved Mira to the interior room, the stone-walled center of the outpost, built to withstand assault. The safe room that every border facility maintained for situations where the border stopped being a metaphor and became a front line. Kelgan dismounted at the gate. He was breathing hard. The altitude, the ride, the fury that had been building for 6 days and that had not diminished during the journey but had compressed, like pressure in a sealed vessel, until the only thing left was the need to release. "Give me the girl," Kelgan said, his voice carried across the outpost yard. "She belongs to Stonefang. She is clan property." Sergeant Vara's response came from the watchtower. Calm, clipped, the voice of a soldier who had been in command positions long enough to recognize desperation, and who understood that desperation was dangerous, but also predictable. "This outpost is treaty ground. Clan authority does not extend here. You are armed and unannounced. State your business or withdraw. My business is the messenger girl you are harboring. She is a subject of Chieftain Theron. She left without authorization. I am here to retrieve her. The woman in our infirmary is under treaty protection as a witness in an active inspection case. She is not available for retrieval." Kelgan's hand went to the training chain at his saddle. The heavy iron links clinked, a sound that carried across the outpost yard with the particular metallic clarity that iron produced when it was being handled by someone who intended to use it. "I don't recognize your treaty," Kelgan said. "I recognize strength, and I am stronger than anything in that wall." He moved toward the gate. The chain swung in his hand, heavy, long, the links catching the early morning light. The same chain, minus 1 link. The chain that had a story embedded in it, a story that was sitting in Phelan's coat pocket, wrapped in linen, stamped with the seal that matched every other link in the coil. Phelan stepped through the gate. He was small. Kelgan was enormous. The difference between them was the difference between a river stone and a boulder. But Phelan had spent 6 years walking into orc fortresses as a treaty inspector. And the thing about walking into places where everyone was bigger than you was that you learned, eventually, that size was not the determining factor. Positioning was. "Kelgan," Phelan said. His voice was quiet, conversational. The voice of a man who was not afraid because he had calculated the situation and the calculation favored him. "You brought the chain." Kelgan looked at the human, the small, thin, unremarkable human who had walked out of a gate in a border outpost and was standing between him and the thing he wanted. "The same chain you used on Mira 3 weeks ago," Phelan continued. "Missing 1 link, the link I extracted from her body, the link with your personal seal on it." The chain stopped swinging. "The link that is currently in my coat, along with a sworn medical confession from your fortress healer, and a full inspection report addressed to the Treaty Tribunal. The tribunal, that is, as of last night's pigeon dispatch, 2 days away." Phelan stepped closer. 1 step. Not aggressive, precise. The step of a man who is placing himself in exactly the right position. "You came here alone, without your father's knowledge. I suspect because your father, whatever his flaws, is a chieftain, and chieftains understand consequences, and the consequence of attacking a treaty outpost is war. You came because you couldn't stand the idea that a messenger girl got away from you, that the person you dragged across a training yard is alive and protected and telling the truth to people who believe her." Kelgan's face was changing. The fury was still there, the compressed, explosive fury that had driven him through the night, but underneath it, something else was appearing. The first flicker of a calculation that did not produce the result he wanted. "Put the chain down," Phelan said. "Or use it, but understand what happens if you use it. You attack a treaty outpost. You assault a treaty inspector. You commit an act of war between species, and you do it while carrying the weapon that proves you assaulted the woman you're trying to silence. He paused. Your father survived 3 weeks of cover-up. He will not survive an act of war. Kelgan looked at the chain in his hand. He looked at the outpost, at the guards on the wall, at the small human standing in front of him with no weapon drawn and no fear visible. The chain dropped. It hit the ground with a heavy, metallic clatter, the sound of iron surrendering to gravity, the sound of a weapon being set down by a man who was not strong enough to carry it anymore. Not physically. The chain weighed nothing compared to Kelgan's strength. But the weight of what the chain meant, the dragging, the screaming, the 40 feet of stone, the 3 weeks of standing, the girl who had crawled and the system that had looked away, the weight of that was more than any man could hold indefinitely. The border guards moved quickly, efficiently, with the trained coordination of a unit that had been prepared. They disarmed Kelgan. They bound his hands, and the chain, the training chain, the custom-forged chain with the personal seal on every link, was used to bind him. Kelgan looked down at the iron on his wrists, his own iron, his own seal. The chain that had been wrapped around a woman's ankles was now wrapped around his own wrists, and the symmetry of it was not lost on anyone in the outpost yard. He was led inside, confined to the detention room. The door was barred. Sergeant Vara turned to Phelan. Her expression was the expression of a commanding officer who had just witnessed a complex situation resolve without bloodshed, and who was professionally satisfied and personally impressed. Inspector, she said, that was well done. It's not done yet, Phelan said. The tribunal needs to arrive, and the clan needs to decide what it does with a chieftain who covered up the brutalization of his own subject. The tribunal arrived on the 8th day. 3 treaty officials, 1 human, 1 orc, 1 mixed heritage adjudicator, accompanied by a detachment of border guards. They brought the authority of the treaty itself, the formal mechanism by which the 2 species had agreed to regulate their shared border and to hold each other accountable for actions that violated the peace. The proceedings took 2 days. Phelan presented his evidence, the chain link with Kelgan's seal, extracted from Mira's wound, the healer's sworn confession, written on formal leather, detailing the injuries and the cover-up, the inspection report, documenting the sepsis, the embedded stone fragments, the deliberate medical neglect. Mira testified. She sat in a chair, an ordinary wooden chair, and she spoke in Orcish, the language that vibrated with truth, and she told the tribunal what had happened. The training ground, the chain, the 40 feet, the crawling, the healer, the chieftain in the doorway, the 21 days. She said, "It hurts when I sit." And then she said, "It doesn't hurt anymore." And the difference between those 2 sentences was the distance between the world that had tried to silence her and the world that had finally heard. Kelgan was sentenced to 15 years in the border detention facility, the neutral prison maintained jointly by human and orc authorities for crimes that fell under treaty jurisdiction. Orvek was stripped of his healer's certification and exiled from the Northern Territories. The tribunal found that his neglect constituted not incompetence, but complicity, the deliberate withholding of care to protect a criminal and to punish a victim. And Chieftain Theron, this was the part that Phelan had understood from the beginning, the part that made the orc system different from the human system in a way that mattered. In a human settlement, the mayor would have been removed by external authority, marshals, courts, the mechanisms of law imposed from outside. In an orc clan, the chieftain was removed by the clan itself. The tribunal did not depose Theron. The tribunal presented the evidence to the Stonefang Clan Council, the body of elders that governed the clan's internal affairs, and the clan council made the decision. It took them 4 hours. 4 hours of deliberation, conducted in the ancient orc method. No arguments, no speeches. Each elder spoke once, stated their position, and sat. The positions were counted. The decision was announced. Theron was stripped of chieftainship. Not exiled, stripped. He remained in the fortress, but as a private citizen without authority, without the seat, without the seal. The clan had looked at what their chieftain had allowed to happen to one of their own, and the clan had decided that the allowing was a failure of the position, and the position no longer belonged to the man who had failed. The justice came from inside, not from the human treaty. not from external authority, from the orc system itself, correcting itself, the way a body corrected an infection when the immune response finally recognized the threat. Mira did not return to Stonefang Hold. She considered it. Phelan told her the option was available. The fortress was under new leadership. Her position at the messenger station was open. Her name had been cleared. She could go back. She did not go back, not because of fear, not because the fortress was dangerous. With Theron removed and Calgan imprisoned, the danger had been systematically dismantled. She did not go back, because going back meant returning to the space that had looked at her wounds and looked away. And while the system had corrected itself, the correction did not erase the 21 days. The 21 days lived in the walls of that fortress, in the training ground stone, in the messenger station counter that she had gripped while her back burned and her legs shook and the parade of averted eyes moved through her door. She could forgive the fortress. She was not sure she could live in it. Instead, she did something that no one in the tribunal's records had anticipated. She built a messenger station at the border. The outpost had a small structure, unused, originally built as a supply shed, that sat on the exact line between orc territory and human territory. The line was literal, a stone marker in the ground, placed by the Treaty Commission marking the boundary. The shed sat with one wall in orc territory and one wall in human territory. Mira claimed it. She requested permission from Sergeant Vara, who granted it with the particular efficient approval of a commanding officer who recognized useful infrastructure when she saw it. She requested materials from the new Stonefang leadership, who sent them without argument because the clan owed her a debt that materials could not repay, but that materials could begin to acknowledge. She built the station herself, with her hands, slowly. Her body was still healing, the scars across her back still tight and tender. But steadily, she reinforced the walls, she installed a counter, she built a scroll rack, she hung a sign, Border Messenger Station, all dispatches, all languages, all peoples. The station sat on the line. Orc messengers arrived from the north. Human couriers arrived from the south. Mira received them all, logged their dispatches, forwarded their messages. She spoke Orcish and common tongue with equal fluency. She charged the same rates to both species. She did not ask anyone's clan affiliation or their nation of origin. She was not orc. She was not human. She was the person on the line, the one who sat at the counter between two worlds and who facilitated the communication that the worlds required to coexist. She had spent her life being told she was too much for one world and too little for the other. Now she had found the place where both assessments were irrelevant, the place where what mattered was not what she was, but what she did. And what she did was carry messages the way she had always carried them across borders, between peoples, with the particular, steady competence of a woman who had taught herself to do the work because no one else was going to teach her. Phelan's patrol route brought him past the border outpost every 6 weeks. Each time he stopped at the messenger station. He brought inspection documents that needed logging and dispatches that needed forwarding, and the particular quiet presence that Mira had learned to recognize as the most valuable thing a person could carry. He did not move in. He did not make declarations. He brought documents and he sat at the counter and he drank the tea she made, orc tea, the sharp kind. And they talked about the border and the dispatches and the weather and the particular ongoing negotiation between two species that were learning to share a territory. The relationship was not dramatic. It was not the kind of story that ballads were written about. No sweeping gestures, no rescues, no declarations of love against a backdrop of mountains and moonlight. It was the kind of story that happened when two people who had each been alone for a long time found that the other person's company made the aloneness unnecessary, and that the discovery was worth more than any ballad because it was real. Every 6 weeks, Phelan arrived. Every 6 weeks, he sat at the counter. Every 6 weeks, the tea was ready. "You keep the tea hot," he said once. "I know when you're coming," she said. "Your patrol is regular. You could just make it when I arrive." "I could. But then you'd arrive to a cold counter and a woman heating water, and that's not the same as arriving to a warm counter and a woman who is expecting you." He looked at her, she looked at him, the counter between them, the line between two worlds running through the floor of a building that belonged to neither world and to both. "Thank you," he said, "for the tea, for being here. I'm a messenger. Being here is what I do. That's not what I meant. I know. On an evening in early autumn, Mira sat at her desk in the border messenger station. The desk was hers. The chair was hers. The station was hers, built with her hands on the line she had chosen, in the space that belonged to neither world and therefore belonged to her. She sat. The chair held her weight. Her back was against the wooden backrest. The backrest she had built herself, shaped to the curve of her spine, sanded smooth because she understood better than most people would ever understand what it meant for a surface to support a body without causing pain. The scars were still there. They would always be there, the parallel lines across her lower back and thighs, the topography of damage that no amount of healing would erase. But the scars were closed. The infection was gone. The stone fragments were gone. The 21 days were behind her, settled into the particular permanent place that survived trauma, occupied in the architecture of a life. Present, acknowledged, no longer determining. Through the window she could see the border marker, the stone in the ground, that said here is where one world ends and another begins. The marker that her station straddled, one wall in each world, the building itself a bridge. A pigeon arrived, a border patrol bird, the kind that Phelan used. She took the message from its leg, unrolled it, read it. 2 words, in Orcish. The words meant, I am here. Not I am coming, I am here. Present tense, the tense of a person who was not announcing an arrival but confirming a presence. The tense that said, wherever you are, that is where I am. She set the message on the desk. She looked at it, she looked at the window, she looked at the chair she was sitting in. The chair that held her. The chair that did not hurt. She had been told her pain was not real. She had been told her truth was dramatic. She had been told that sitting through it would make it pass. And for 21 days she had stood, not because she was strong, but because she had no choice, because the system that was supposed to protect her had decided that her suffering was less important than the comfort of the man who caused it. And then a man had walked into her station and read her body in 30 seconds and said, I believe you, and the believing had been enough. Not the treatment. The treatment saved her body. The believing saved the rest of her. She sat at her desk. She picked up her pen. She opened her dispatch ledger. The border messenger station was open. All dispatches, all languages, all peoples. Mira logged the day's messages with the precision of a woman who had taught herself everything she knew and who had survived everything she had survived and who was sitting without pain, in her own chair, at her own desk, in her own place. For the first time in her life, the door was open, the tea was warm, and it didn't hurt when she sat.